Thank you very much, Jacob. It's a great honor for me to attend and to make a presentation to this symposium. I will first define the context and the scope of my presentation. The COVID-19 epidemic has particularly affected the global economy, as all of us know, but most specifically, it has hit very hard the Eurozone. The second point is that the so-called second wave has created a havoc in some countries that had before very well managed the wave of spring 2020, like Germany or Portugal, by example. And I think that this is making significant contrast with East Asia, where forecasted GDP growth is probably to recover very faster than in Europe and very faster than in the EU. Then, by the way, there is still a very significant difference among EU countries and among Eurozone countries, of course, and this is also a matter of concern. So, the end will be, will the EU or the Eurozone is accumulating an historic lag toward Asia in the pandemic context. So the first problem is to assess the COVID-19 double shock. With the spreading of the COVID-19, the world faced a crisis without precedent. And still, the global economy is recovering very slowly, but is still recovering. And it's recovering mostly from the consequences of what could be called the Great Lockdown of March-April 2020, and in Europe, the present lockdown in most of countries. At regional level, however, the picture is quite different, mostly in Europe. The COVID-19 is making for a strong divergence at the regional level. Then let's first have a look onto the latest data which has been published by the IMF on January 21st this year. We could see, of course, that China, India too, and that's quite interesting because India has suffered most of the pandemic, and emerging and developing countries of Asia are developing now or are supposed to develop in the next 2 years very much than what is supposed to develop the Euro area and developed countries, by the way. The usual divergence in GDP growth seems to have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and the rebound slack of advanced economies is to be noted. Not surprisingly, the slack is worse for the EMU, which is not to recoup its 2018 level before 2022. So the second point is to have a look on the growth divergence in Europe, and you can see then first the amount of difference between China is emerging and developing Asia, and then countries from the Eurozone. What's more, it's very, very interesting to assess the divergence between Southern Europe, like Spain, Italy, and countries like Germany. France is probably here, I think probably here given a much too optimistic a forecast because the expected recovery looks already blurred, and I really think that forecasts for France are probably over-optimistic. Now, what is very important is that inside Europe, the divergence between economy, the German economy, and the four other big economies, that is France, UK, Italy, and Spain, has been very heavily affected, mostly during the second wave, but too, it seems, with the first wave. Now, the industrial production and the COVID-19 impact for the first wave only because the data are not going further than August 2020. Of course, China shows the first drop, but that was to be expected because the pandemic exploded first in China. But what is very interesting is its rate of recovery, and even more when compared to other countries. One country which seems to have weathered the storm quite not better, but less bad than other countries was, of course, Russia. So China has been affected earlier than other countries. China and emerging Asia are recovering much faster. What is very important is to note that some countries like France, which boost the important support to population income, are not doing better than countries which have
global source chain, including the China part, since the arrival of international expert teams.
Than some countries which have much less supported the population. Now, have a look on the retail trade, also first wave. Retail trade statistics are quite interesting because here you can see that China had not, by the end of August of last year, recovered the shock of the pandemic. By the way, some other countries had more or less recovered the shock, and Germany certainly was the country which fared the best. Now, how the European Union and the Eurozone have weathered the COVID-19 pandemic. So, as I have said, lockdowns have been implemented in different European countries, leading to different economic consequences. And what is important also to see is that the second wave of lockdown now seems to have been a bit less destructive than the first one. That's probably the learning effect of the population. People have learned how to live, how to work under this lockdown situation. Also the fact that lockdown have been implemented to a lesser degree during the second wave than during the first. Here we have GDP forecast error and lockdown stringency, the comparison between Europe and other. It's quite interesting to see that some countries of Europe are not only very to the right of the curve as far as lockdown stringency, but very low for GDP forecast error. What is also striking is the situation of Taiwan. As has been said by Professor Richard Koo, Taiwan has been very less affected than other countries, and it's not it's not surprising that the results have been so good, but also South Korea, Hong Kong, Russia. Japan too is not faring too bad. After that, it's quite interesting to see that the USA, at least for the first wave, because we still haven't data for the impact of the second wave, the USA at first doesn't seem to have been so much affected than other countries. Well, it's quite interesting to see that actually no Asian countries, but for India, and of course India is a very, very big country, no Asian countries had a GDP forecast error worse than 10%, when 6 European countries had one. And on the other side, if we are looking country with GDP forecast error of less than 5%, we are to find only two European countries, Sweden and Ireland. And I'm making the guess that Ireland, with the current second wave taking place, is probably going down on this point. On the contrary, a lot of Asian countries, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and a country midway between Asia and Europe had one, that's Russia. An important point is that European countries have tried to protect workers, but the approach has been quite different among countries. Here you can see data for the share of employees and self-employees in monetary compensation. It's quite interesting to see that France has very much protected employees and not so much self-employees people. Actually, France is a country where the highest proportion of employees got government monetary compensation. On the contrary, Cyprus, well, Cyprus is not a very big country, but Italy, and the size of the Italian GDP is not very far from the size of the French GDP, has much less protected its employees and much more protected people which were self-employed. So this graph is making very clear the difference of approach between countries on this point. Another very important point is the fact that the number of jobs which has been the number of jobs supported by governmental measures has peaked in April with more or less 30 million of people under government support, and it's probably now going around 10 to 14 million linked to the second wave of the epidemic. Now, we have to look choice. And choice has been far-reaching. The first problem was the temporal mix of measures, that is, the balance between immediate support and the more language assistance to the economy. The second very important problem is the balance between fiscal policy and monetary policy, which was major an issue. And then we can say that if the European Central Bank provided a very effective support, mostly, but not only through the PEPP, it can be said the same from the US, with recovery plan, which has been much debate among European about the European so-called recovery plan, but you have to know that the first impact of the recovery plan are not to take place before the end of summer 2021 at best. I'm saying at best. And I'm still afraid that the first impacts are not to be felt between the end of 2021. A last problem is the fact that debt accumulation is raising the financial stability issue, with a debate taking place about a debt cancellation program. Mrs. Lagarde very firmly opposed that, but nevertheless, this is a debate taking place, and public debate taking place in a lot of countries like France, also Italy, and I expect that this debate is to have very important consequences. So here you can see the difference between the support through fiscal policy and the support through monetary policy. It's very important to say that in countries like France, Italy, Germany, most of the support was done by monetary policy. On the other side, if you are looking to countries like Austria, Greece, Ireland, but even to countries like Luxembourg, the share of the monetary policy was much less than what it was in Italy, Germany, and France. Now, the difference in recovery path in the EU and the Eurozone. While recovery in China has been faster than expected, the global economy long ascended back to pre-pandemic level of activity remained prone to setbacks. That's absolutely obvious. But it can be taken for granted that the European Union and the Eurozone have stalled in relation to the process of economic recovery in Southern Asia. And this stall is quite significant, in the fact that it could herald a form of marginalization of the EU and the Eurozone. This is what is now one of the main centers of global economic growth. The change in relative shares of the world GDP in PPP, of course, was already noticeable, since the 1990s. But the COVID-19 induced a trend which largely exacerbated this situation. So the question which can be asked is, will this break, will the new break is to take place in forthcoming year? Here you have data from 1989 to 2019. Well, you can see, of course, the fall of the G7 group, the rise of emerging and developing Asia. The fact that the European Union went down to nearly, around 24% to around 15%, and the fact that also advanced economies like Canada, Australia, were more or less at the same level. Now, what is very interesting is the break of 2020, what you can see is the fact that emerging and developing Asia went up, and it's quite obvious because the recovery first have been less harder than European country, but also the fact that the recovery took place much earlier. But nevertheless, if we are to have some confidence in this forecast data, the share of the European Union could drop from a bit more than 15% to around 12% by 2022-2023. So, of course, this difference in the path of recovery in economic activity reflects the different strategy for supporting the economy adapted by each country. The volume of support calculated as a percentage of GDP vary widely, but there is also a clear difference between countries that support their economies through bank loans and bank shares, and those who favor budgetary and fiscal action, either through direct subsidies or through tax cuts. Industrial production share in each economy is also playing major role. Then the difference between the recovery trajectories of economic activity in developing Asia and European Union, which was already apparent before the arrival of the second wave of the epidemic. With this second wave, we will have to expect an even greater difference. So in conclusion, we'll first ask the question, is the European Monetary Union and the European Union are dropping into insignificance, into economic insignificance? Share in the world GDP went down from nearly 24% in 1989 to probably around 12% in 2022-2023. Second question, has the euro still grows in some of the countries that have adopted it? The economic situation of Southern Europe is clearly here a matter of concern. Look at the situation in Italy and Spain, where the situation is very bad. Look also to the situation of France. This situation, which in fact actually predates the COVID-19 epidemic, is very evident when we compare the different recovery trajectory of economic activity. And then it is clear that the COVID-19 epidemic has played the role of both revealing and accelerating change that have been noticeable for 10 years now. The shift of the world growth pole to the Atlantic, from the Atlantic zone to the Pacific zone, and more specifically to Southern Asia, seems clearly irreversible today. Thank you.